There's a peculiar kind of silence that settles over abandoned places. It's not the quiet of peace, but a weighted stillness, as if the air itself holds its breath. That's what I felt the night I stumbled upon the station. I wasn't supposed to be there. My car had broken down on a stretch of road that seemed to stretch forever into nowhere. With no cell signal and no passing cars, I decided to walk. That's when I saw the faint glow in the distance. A soft, pulsing light cutting through the darkness. At first, I thought it was a house, maybe a street lamp near a small neighborhood. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't either. It was a train station, or at least what was left of one. The station was old, its wooden frame warped and grayed by time. Weeds had claimed the platform, growing tall in the cracks of the pavement. There were no tracks anymore, just an expanse of gravel swallowed by grass. But what caught my attention was the signal light. It stood tall at the edge of the platform, its green glow steady and unblinking. There was something hypnotic about it, something that made me uneasy. It didn't flicker or waver, even though the wires leading to it were frayed and disconnected. I told myself it was just a leftover from when the station was operational, maybe powered by an old battery or some forgotten electrical grid. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. It felt alive, like it was watching me. I hesitated at the edge of the platform, unsure whether to stay or turn back. The night seemed darker around the station, the air heavier. I wanted to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. The silence broke suddenly with a faint sound, soft, rhythmic, and far too familiar. It was the sound of a train whistle, carried on the wind. But there were no tracks. The train whistle echoed in the night, distant yet clear, like a ghost calling from the edge of the world. I froze, my heart racing, but there was no train in sight. No tracks, no engine, nothing. I looked back at the signal light. It hadn't wavered, its steady green glow cutting through the fog that had started to creep in. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I found myself stepping closer, almost against my will. My feet seemed to move on their own, drawn to the light like a moth to a flame. The air around me grew thick, the kind of damp chill that seeped into your bones and made every breath feel heavier. The grass rustled behind me, though I was certain there was no one there. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down, making my thoughts feel sluggish, as if the very place was trying to keep me there. As I reached the base of the signal, I noticed something strange. The light wasn't simply casting a glow on the platform. It seemed to be pulling the darkness around it, swallowing it whole. The shadows on the edges of the station seemed to stretch and bend, moving in unnatural ways. I stared at the signal for a long time, unsure what I expected to happen. Maybe I was hoping it would blink out, as all lights do eventually, but it didn't. The light burned brighter, more intense, as if aware of my gaze. And then, just as I was about to turn away, the train whistle blew again, closer this time. I stumbled back, panic rising in my throat. My eyes darted around the platform, expecting to see something, anything that could explain the sound. But the platform was empty. No train, no tracks, not even a sign of movement. The whistle sounded again, sharper this time, and I could have sworn I felt a tremor in the ground beneath my feet. It was as though something was approaching, something heavy, something real. I turned to leave, but my eyes were drawn back to the signal light. It was brighter than before, almost blinding now, and I saw, for just a moment, a figure standing beside it. A figure dressed in dark clothing, its face obscured by shadow. It didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. The train whistle sounded a third time, closer still, but the figure didn't move. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in place by that figure by the signal. Seconds? Minutes? Time seemed to stretch and warp around me. My mind was racing, heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to run, but my legs felt as heavy as stone. Finally the figure moved, not toward me, but to the side of the platform, stepping into the shadows where the light didn't reach. I blinked, and just like that, it was gone. I stumbled back, the cool night air finally cutting through the haze in my head. I turned, my feet moving before my mind could catch up, and I walked quickly down the overgrown path toward the small shack I had noticed earlier. Maybe someone was there. Someone who could explain what the hell was going on. The shack was little more than a shack now. Its wooden frame was sagging, the roof almost caved in, but there was a light flickering faintly through the cracked window. It was dim, yellow, like a candle or an old lantern. I knocked on the door, not expecting an answer, but hoping for something. The wind howled in response, but nothing else stirred. I was about to leave when the door creaked open on its own. I stood frozen for a moment, then slowly pushed the door further. Inside was a man. He was old, his skin pale, wrinkled, eyes sunken into his face like a man who had seen far too much, and he sat in a chair near a fire that barely flickered. He wore an old, weathered uniform that I almost didn't recognize at first, a train station master's uniform. "You've come," he said in a voice like gravel, though I hadn't spoken. I took a cautious step inside. What? Who are you?" The man's eyes never left me as he slowly rocked back and forth in his chair, a soft, rhythmic motion that somehow unsettled me even more. "The keeper of the station," he answered, his voice low and raspy. "I keep watch." "Watch over what?" I asked, barely able to hide my impatience. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. "The tracks," he muttered, almost too quietly to hear. "The ones that don't lead anywhere. The ones that never end." I frowned. "There are no tracks here. There's nothing here but this station and a signal light." The old man chuckled, a dry sound that echoed in the small room. "That light, it never fades. It's always on, waiting for someone." "Waiting for someone?" I repeated, confusion growing. "For the train that never stops, the train that never returns." His eyes met mine with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. "It's coming for you too." I stepped back, my heart racing. "I don't understand." "The train," he continued, his voice more urgent now, "it's not like any train you've seen. It doesn't run on tracks, it runs on something else, and once you see it, it doesn't let you go. It's coming, and it'll be here soon. You'll hear it before you see it. It's the last sound you'll ever hear." My mind was spinning, but I couldn't tear myself away from his words. "What do you mean? How do you know all this?" He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling clarity. "Because I've been here too long. I've been waiting too. I've seen it all, and you will too. It won't stop until it takes you." I took a step back, my body trembling with fear. "I need to leave. This place, it's cursed." The old man's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "You can't leave. Not now. Not once you've seen it. You'll always be drawn back, like the others." His words echoed in my mind as I backed out of the shack, the door closing softly behind me. My breath came in shallow gasps and my legs felt like jelly. What had I just heard? What was the old man talking about? But then I heard it. A soft, distant whistle, cutting through the still night air. Closer than before. And that was when I realized he was right. The train was coming. The whistle sounded again, louder this time, as if it were right beside me. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the darkness, my eyes straining to see anything. There were no tracks, no signs of movement, yet the sound was unmistakable, a low, mournful wail carried on the wind. I turned toward the platform again, the signal light still burning steady and green, but now it seemed wrong. It was too bright, too intense, like it was pushing out the darkness, making the shadows grow long and twisted. I could hear the rattle now, faint but growing louder, the unmistakable sound of metal against metal, the screech of wheels on tracks. But there were no tracks. How could there be a train? Yet I knew it was coming. The sound was too real, too immediate. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble, just a slight vibration at first, like the earth was reacting to the train's presence. I staggered, my legs unsteady as the rumble grew stronger. The platform creaked and groaned, as if it too was awakening from a long slumber. I stepped forward, unable to stop myself. The whistle sounded again, and this time it was deafening. My ears rang with the force of it, as if the sound itself was trying to tear me apart. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A dim light on the horizon, growing brighter and larger with every passing second. It wasn't like any train I'd ever seen. The headlights were too sharp, too cold, casting an eerie glow across the landscape. There was no body, no engine, but the shape was unmistakable, a train, or what used to be a train. It was a massive, dark silhouette, its edges flickering like a mirage. The wheels never touched the ground, floating just above the platform, sending waves of distortion through the air. The sound grew louder, the screeching metal now deafening, as if the train were trying to force its way into my reality. The platform seemed to stretch endlessly as the train approached, the rails twisting and warping in the air. But there was nothing to see below it. No tracks, no support beams, just the glowing green signal light and the fading world around me. And then it was there. The phantom train. Its presence overwhelming. Its form both real and unreal. It seemed to exist in two places at once, flickering between dimensions like a nightmare that couldn't decide where it wanted to live. I could hear the whispers now, soft voices speaking in languages I didn't understand, calling out to me from within the train. The doors slid open, though I hadn't heard them move. The light from within the train was cold, harsh, casting shadows across the empty platform. I could feel the weight of it, the pull of something ancient and wrong, urging me to step forward, to board. I took a step back, heart racing in my chest, but my feet wouldn't listen. The train was there, and I was drawn to it like a moth to a flame, despite every instinct telling me to run. A figure appeared in the doorway. It was cloaked in shadow, its face hidden, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but still, I couldn't make out the words. The figure raised a hand, motioning for me to come closer. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, my breath shallow, my heart thudding in my ears. The train's whistle sounded again, closer now, a final, hollow cry that sent a jolt of terror through my body. I took a step forward, and then another. And then, before I knew it, I was walking toward the phantom train. It didn't matter how much I fought it, how much I tried to resist. I was already lost, already part of it. The whispers inside the train grew louder, welcoming me into the darkness that would never end. The doors closed behind me with a hiss, and the train began to move, sliding through the empty station, never touching the ground, never stopping. The world outside the windows blurred, the scenery warping and twisting into strange shapes. And then, I understood. This was the train that never returned. This was the end. The train moved with a strange, unnatural speed, yet it never seemed to get any closer to its destination. The world outside the windows twisted and blurred, as if we were traveling through a place that didn't belong to time or space. The landscape was a dark smear of gray, the occasional flash of light like an illusion flickering in and out of existence. I sat in a seat near the window, my hands gripping the armrests, but I didn't remember sitting down. I didn't remember anything. My mind felt distant, disconnected, as if I were floating in a dream, or more accurately, a nightmare. The figure from the doorway was sitting across from me now, its face still hidden in shadow, its eyes, if they were eyes at all, never leaving mine. The whispers from the train had ceased, but their presence lingered in the air, thick and oppressive. They were still there, all around me, just out of reach. The train itself seemed to hum with a strange vibrating energy, the walls pulsing with a faint light that never dimmed, never flickered. The air was cold, but not in a way that made you shiver. It was a deep, suffocating cold, the kind that makes you feel as though you've been buried alive, entombed in darkness for eternity. I tried to speak, but no words came. My mouth moved, but it felt like I wasn't in control of it. I was a passenger in my own body, trapped in this horrible train that seemed to carry nothing but the sound of my own racing heartbeat. I looked around, desperate to see something familiar, anything that would ground me. But there was nothing. The train had no windows that led to anything recognizable, no lights from the outside world. It was as if we were in a void, a place where nothing existed except for the train and its passengers. I tried to stand, but my legs were too weak, as though they no longer belonged to me. I couldn't move, couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, by the figure across from me, by the shadows that filled the train, by the eternal green light that glowed faintly at the edges of my vision. The figure across from me finally moved, though its actions were slow, deliberate. It raised its hand, and in that motion, the air grew even colder, the light even dimmer. There was no sound, no change in the hum of the train, but I could feel it. A shift in the atmosphere, like the moment right before a storm. "You're not leaving," it said. Its voice was the same gravelly whisper I had heard from the old man at the station, but now it was much closer, much clearer. I swallowed hard, unable to speak, but my mind screamed at me to understand. "Once you board," the figure continued, its tone almost compassionate, "there is no going back. Not for you, not for anyone who sees the train." My breath caught in my throat. What do you mean? What is this place? The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it tilted its head slightly as if considering me. This is the place between places. The place where lost things go. Souls, memories, people who saw too much. People like you. I recoiled at its words, but I could feel the truth in them. There was no escape from this train, no way back to the world I once knew. The endless glowing green light, the whispers that still circled around me, were all part of the same truth. Once you board, you are part of it forever. The train moved on, the flickering glow of the signal light now almost blinding. My eyes stung, but I couldn't look away. It was calling to me, the light, the one I had first seen at the station. It was like a thread tying me to this fate, to this eternal journey. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to break free, but I couldn't. The train was already part of me, already pulling me into its cold embrace. And then, as the train continued its endless journey through the void, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A figure, standing near the back of the car, watching me. A woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with terror. She was silent, but her eyes spoke volumes. She had been here longer than I had. I turned away, but the image stayed with me. The woman, the figure, all the others who had boarded before me. They were here, trapped in the same endless cycle. The train would never stop. The signal light would never fade. And I was one of them now. The eternal glow burned brighter, and I knew that, no matter how much I tried to fight it, there was no escaping this train. It was the only thing that was real now. And it would never let me go. I'm not one to believe in superstitions or ghost stories. I've always chalked up odd experiences to coincidence, an overactive imagination, or the strange things your mind does when it's tired. But what happened on that train? It's harder to explain. I boarded the late-night train from the city to the small town I'd been visiting for work. The train was mostly empty, save for a few scattered passengers, none of whom I knew. I chose a seat near the window, the soft hum of the train lulling me into a state of half-dreaming as I scrolled through my phone. It was quiet, a peaceful ride, just the way I liked it. But there was something strange about the atmosphere. A subtle weight in the air, a sense of being watched that I couldn't shake. I glanced around the car, but no one seemed to be paying any attention to me. A woman sat 2 rows ahead, eyes fixed on a book, and a man across the aisle was asleep with his head resting against the window. And then there was the feeling. It was faint at first, like a shiver down my spine, or the sensation of someone standing just behind you. I couldn't pinpoint it, but it was there, nagging at the edges of my mind. I shook it off, trying to focus on the scrolling newsfeed on my phone, but the feeling didn't go away. It wasn't until we passed a station that I noticed it again. This time, the sensation was stronger, as if someone was sitting just beside me, invisible but tangible, pressing up against the empty seat next to mine. I looked over, instinctively checking to see if anyone had taken the seat, but the row was still empty. The lights flickered briefly as the train slowed to a stop, casting strange shadows across the car, but there was no one there. Just my imagination, I muttered to myself, forcing a smile. I adjusted my jacket and leaned back in my seat, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I glanced again at the other passengers. The woman with the book had turned a page, her eyes never leaving the pages, and the man across from me still slept soundly. Yet, something was different. I had the distinct sense that there was someone else in the car, someone I hadn't noticed before. I could almost feel their gaze on me, though I couldn't see them. I rubbed my temples, trying to clear my mind, but as we passed through another station, the feeling became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the sensation of being watched anymore, it was the feeling of someone sitting right next to me, breathing softly, close enough that I could hear the faintest exhale. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I sat perfectly still, heart racing, trying to convince myself that this was all in my head, that the train had just become too quiet, too still. But no matter how much I tried to reason with myself, I could still feel it. The presence beside me, as real as the seat I was sitting on, pressing in close. I wanted to look over, to see if someone had snuck into the seat next to mine, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt wrong, as if breaking the silence would expose something I wasn't ready to face. The train began to move again, pulling away from the station with its usual rhythmic motion. But the sensation didn't fade. It followed me, sitting next to me, breathing in the stillness of the car. I finally turned my head, slowly, hoping to confirm that no one was there, to reassure myself that it was all in my mind. But when I looked to my left, the seat beside me was still empty. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there. Someone who had always been there. The train car felt colder now, despite the heat running through the vents above. I tried to shake the feeling of being watched, tried to focus on anything but the empty seat next to mine. But no matter how much I willed myself to relax, that unease clung to me like a shadow. As the train sped along the tracks, the rhythmic clattering of the wheels against the rails seemed to distort, growing louder and more erratic. The lights flickered again, and I instinctively looked around, searching for any sign that would explain the strange tension hanging in the air. That's when I saw it. The seat beside me, the one that had been empty just moments ago, was now occupied. It wasn't just a trick of the light or my imagination. The fabric of the seat had shifted, the cushions subtly depressed as if someone had just sat down, the faintest indent left behind. But no one was there. I felt my stomach tighten. I looked to the other passengers, but no one seemed to notice. The woman was still reading her book, her face half hidden by the pages, and the man across the aisle remained asleep, oblivious to everything around him. I turned back to the empty seat. The indent was still there, still fresh, as though someone had just vacated it. But the air around me felt heavier, more oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, had been sitting there was still close. I glanced at my phone, desperate for a distraction, but my fingers fumbled over the screen, the bright light of my device doing little to banish the creeping dread that seemed to wrap itself around me. The quiet, the isolation, the way the train seemed to stretch on forever, all of it made the situation feel more unnatural. "Get a grip," I whispered to myself, forcing a breath. "It's nothing. It's just your mind playing tricks." But as I shifted in my seat, I felt it again. The subtle shift in the air beside me, like a presence settling in. The seat beside mine, despite being empty, seemed full. The temperature around it had dropped, and the quiet hum of the train suddenly felt deafening. I couldn't take it anymore. I looked up, my eyes darting quickly to the empty space beside me, hoping for some kind of answer, some explanation for what I was feeling. And that's when I saw it, the faintest outline of a person, almost invisible, hovering in the air next to the seat. It was like looking through a window smeared with fog. Something there, but unclear, shifting and indistinct. I blinked, and it was gone. Just like that, the seat was empty again. I glanced around at the other passengers. They didn't seem to have noticed. They were all wrapped up in their own worlds, lost in books or sleep, unaware of the strange shift in the air. But I couldn't forget it. The presence, the weight, the way the seat had been occupied, then suddenly vacated, as if someone had sat down just long enough to make their presence known before vanishing again. A voice in the back of my mind screamed for me to get off at the next stop, to leave this train and its unsettling atmosphere behind. But the thought of stepping off into the night, alone in an unfamiliar place, was just as terrifying. The train continued its journey, each mile stretching into the next, and the presence beside me seemed to grow stronger, more solid with every passing minute. I could feel it now, right there, hovering next to me, just out of sight. And I realized with a sinking feeling in my chest that I wasn't alone. Not anymore. The train had entered a stretch of empty countryside, the landscape outside nothing but blackness, broken only by the occasional flicker of a distant light or the blur of trees in the dark. Inside, the car seemed even quieter, the air heavier, as though the train had passed beyond the world I knew and into something different. I couldn't stop thinking about the seat next to me, how it had been taken, how the presence beside me had been so close, so real, even though I couldn't see anyone. It felt like a phantom, like something from a dream, or worse, from a nightmare. I tried to focus, but my mind kept wandering back to the seat. It was as though I couldn't escape the weight of the invisible presence pressing against me. The cold air around it, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, it all made my skin crawl. I forced myself to look around again, to shake the feeling that something was watching me, but there was no one else in the car to explain it. The woman with the book, still engrossed in her reading, and the man across the aisle, his face still pressed against the glass, both seemed to be unaware of the strange tension that filled the air. It was as if they couldn't feel it, couldn't sense what I was experiencing. I turned back to the empty seat beside me. The indent from earlier was still there, but now it seemed deeper, more defined, as if someone had just moved again. My breath caught in my throat, and I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, trying to ignore the growing panic rising in my chest. "Get a grip," I muttered under my breath. "It's just your mind. You're tired, that's all." But deep down I knew something was wrong. Something had changed on this train, something I couldn't explain. And then suddenly I heard it. A voice, soft but clear, coming from the seat beside me. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. "You're not alone." I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs and my breath caught in my throat. I turned to my left, but no one was there. The seat was still empty, as it had been for the past few minutes, but the words echoed in my mind, their source still lingering in the air. I glanced quickly at the other passengers, but they hadn't moved. The woman with the book, her eyes glued to the page, and the man across the aisle, his face now completely pressed against the glass, seemed oblivious. I swallowed hard, feeling the cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. The voice had been so clear, so familiar. It wasn't a whisper. It was like someone had spoken right into my ear. "You're not alone," the voice repeated, closer now, though I couldn't place where it was coming from. I wanted to scream to ask who was there, but the words stuck in my throat. I could feel the presence again, weight in the air beside me, as if something or someone was sitting just out of sight, just beyond my reach. And then it spoke again, but this time the words were different. "Do you remember me?" The question hit me like a bolt of lightning. My blood ran cold. The voice was so familiar, so hauntingly close. I knew I had heard it before, but I couldn't place where or when. I racked my brain, trying to recall where I had heard those words, that voice, but nothing came to mind. The train was speeding along the tracks, the rhythmic clattering of the wheels now deafening in the silence between us. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the empty seat. Then, out of nowhere, the figure appeared. It wasn't a sudden flash or a dramatic manifestation. It was more subtle, like something slipping into focus from the corners of my mind. At first, I only saw a shadow in the seat beside me, barely perceptible, just a vague shape sitting next to me. But as I blinked, the outline sharpened, and there, in the dim light of the train car, was a man. He was dressed in an old, worn jacket, his hair dark and disheveled, his eyes locked onto mine. His face seemed strangely familiar, though I was certain I had never seen him before. His expression was unreadable, a mix of something cold and something almost pleading. "Do you remember me?" he asked again, his voice steady but full of a quiet urgency. I swallowed, unable to speak, my breath shallow and uneven. There was something about him, something I couldn't place, something that gnawed at the edges of my mind. His presence wasn't threatening, but it was so unsettling, so wrong. "Who are you?" I finally managed to choke out. The man's lips curved into a faint, sad smile. "Someone you've been running from," he said softly. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. The seat beside me was empty again. I blinked, shaking my head, trying to process what had just happened. The man, his face, his voice, the feeling that lingered in the air, were all gone, as if they had never been there. The train car was as quiet as it had been before, and the other passengers remained unaware of anything out of the ordinary. I looked around once more, desperately searching for an explanation, but there was nothing. Just the hum of the train, the flickering of the overhead lights, and the sense that something or someone was still watching me. But now I knew. I wasn't alone. And whatever had just happened, whatever I had just seen, was only the beginning. The lights flickered again, but this time they didn't come back on right away. For a moment, the train car was plunged into complete darkness. The only sound, the rapid beating of my heart against my chest. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me, suffocating, as if the world outside had stopped existing. I held my breath, waiting for the lights to return, but the seconds stretched on like hours. My hands gripped the armrests, my knuckles turning white from the pressure. I tried to stay calm, tried to convince myself that this was just another malfunction, another simple glitch in the system. But the air felt thick with something more than just the absence of light. It was as though something unseen, something wrong, had settled into the very space around me. Then the lights returned, their sudden brilliance blinding after the pitch-black darkness. I blinked rapidly, my vision adjusting to the harsh light, but when I looked around the train car, it was no longer the same. The passengers, if they could even be called that, had changed. The woman who had been reading her book was now staring straight ahead, her eyes wide and unblinking, her body frozen in place. The man across the aisle, still pressed against the glass, was no longer asleep. His eyes were wide open too, but they were empty, hollow, as though he was no longer truly aware of anything around him. They weren't real. I could feel it now. Something was wrong with them. The way they stared at nothing, the stillness in their posture, it was like they weren't alive anymore. But the worst part was the whispers, faint at first but unmistakable in the silence. Low, hushed voices that seemed to come from all around me. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they were speaking to me. Not to anyone else, but to me. Don't listen to them. I whirled around, searching the car for the source of the voice, but there was no one. The figure beside me, the one who had been there earlier, was gone. The seat beside me once again sat empty. The whispers continued, louder now, as though the very walls of the train were speaking. Come with us. Stay with us. You are the one who called us. My heart pounded in my chest as the whispers grew more urgent, more insistent. They didn't make sense, but they were starting to feel like a threat, like a warning I couldn't ignore. I looked around the train car again. The passengers were still unmoving, still staring, right, but their eyes weren't focused on me. They were focused on something else, something I couldn't see. The whispers came from all directions, and I felt them growing closer, their presence tightening around me. Who are you? I finally whispered, my voice trembling in the overwhelming stillness. No answer came at first, but the whispers softened, almost as if considering the question. Then, one voice, clearer than the rest, spoke directly into my ear. We are those who were lost. We are those who couldn't leave. My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but my voice was locked in my throat as if something was keeping it from escaping. The air around me felt oppressive, suffocating, as though I was being drawn into a trap I couldn't see. Why? I managed to choke out, though my voice sounded alien to me, like it came from a place far beyond the train. Why are you doing this? The whispers paused, as if they were considering my question. Then, the voice returned, even clearer than before, almost as if it were coming from inside my own head. Because you are ours now. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, the shadows growing longer, deeper, as if they were stretching to reach me. The temperature in the car dropped, the air growing frigid, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. The whispers became louder, overlapping, drowning out all other sounds. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. Their voices filled my mind, pushing against my thoughts, drowning me in their presence. You're one of us, the voice repeated, now filling every corner of my mind, every crevice of my soul. I stumbled back in my seat, my pulse racing, my hands shaking as I tried to hold on to something, anything, to keep myself grounded. But the train car seemed to warp, bending and twisting as if it were alive, its very walls closing in on me. I tried to get up, tried to move, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I couldn't escape the sensation that I was being drawn deeper into the whispers, deeper into whatever nightmare this train had become. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, the whispers stopped. The coldness retreated, and the train seemed to settle back into its normal rhythm. But I knew it wasn't over. I could still feel their eyes on me, still hear the echo of their voices in my mind, like a distant hum I couldn't shake. The train was moving again, the sound of the wheels against the rails a constant reminder that we were still on this journey, still heading somewhere. Somewhere I didn't understand. The woman with the book turned the page, the man across from me returned to his silent gaze, and the train seemed to continue, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better now. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were just waiting, lurking in the dark, waiting for the next moment when I'd be alone again. Waiting to remind me that there was no escape from this place, from this train, from whatever it was that I had gotten myself into. And now, the whispers weren't just in the dark. They were inside my mind, and they wouldn't let me forget. I thought I understood fear. I thought I knew what it felt like to be truly scared, to have your heart race and your body freeze in a moment of terror. But that was before the train, before the whispers, before the empty seat beside me, before the feeling that time itself had stretched and fractured. Now nothing felt real anymore. The train, the passengers, the very idea of being on a journey, it all felt wrong. As though the train was the only thing that existed in the world, and everything else, the places we passed, the cities, the people, they were just fragments of some forgotten memory. I looked at the other passengers again. The woman with the book was still reading, though her face had grown paler, more gaunt. The man across from me, still pressed against the glass, no longer even seemed human. His skin was too pale, his eyes too wide, and his lips were a strange shade of blue. But he didn't move, he didn't blink. It was as though he was trapped in some eternal sleep. It wasn't just the passengers, it was the train itself. It felt infinite. The sound of the wheels grinding against the tracks was no longer rhythmic. It was erratic, like the train was speeding up and slowing down, jerking along in a disjointed motion. The lights flickered again, casting strange, shifting shadows across the car, and I had the distinct feeling that we weren't moving forward at all. I reached up to check my watch, but my wrist was bare. I stared down at my empty wrist, confused for a moment. My watch had been there earlier, hadn't it? But now, it was gone. In its place, there was nothing but a cold, empty feeling. And then I looked at the windows. The landscape outside was a blur of darkness. We had passed through miles of countryside already, and yet it seemed like we had never moved at all. The fields, the trees, the distant lights, they were all the same. Over and over, the same stretch of nothingness. I couldn't remember the last time we had passed a station. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen any sign of civilization. It was as though the train was isolated from the rest of the world. We were alone, or trapped. I looked around again. There was no exit, no sign of where we were going. The door at the far end of the car was still locked, and I couldn't bring myself to approach it. I knew that whatever was behind it would only lead to more confusion, more uncertainty. The air in the train car was thick with something I couldn't name, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. The whispers had stopped, but their absence didn't bring me comfort. The silence was worse, more suffocating. It felt like the train was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for me. "Why don't you join us?" The voice wasn't the whispers. It wasn't the phantom figure who had spoken to me before. It was something else. Something familiar. I turned to the empty seat beside me, the place where the man had sat just hours ago. But now the seat was filled by someone I thought I had left behind. It was my own reflection. I blinked, and for a moment I thought I was seeing things. But no, it wasn't just the shadows or the dim lighting. The reflection was there, sitting beside me, staring back at me with those same eyes, those same hollowed-out features. My heart leaped in my chest. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure beside me mirrored my every movement, its face a twisted version of my own, eyes wide and empty, like someone who'd forgotten how to be human. "Don't you want to stay?" it whispered, its voice a low, familiar hum in the air. "We can be together, forever. All you have to do is stay with us." I recoiled, my hands shaking as I backed away into the corner of my seat. The reflection didn't move. It stayed perfectly still, its eyes locked onto mine, watching, waiting. The train screeched to a halt. The sudden jolt threw me forward, my face slamming against the cold window. My breath fogged up the glass as I pushed myself upright, heart pounding in my chest. But when I looked out the window, nothing had changed. No station, no stop. We had simply stopped. The train, suspended in the darkness, didn't seem to be moving, even though I could hear the faint sound of the wheels still turning. There was no sign of life, no sign of anywhere we had been. I glanced around again, looking for any sign that this wasn't happening, that I hadn't lost my mind, that I wasn't trapped in some endless loop. But the other passengers remained just as still as before, their eyes fixed on the same unblinking stare. And then, slowly, the figure beside me began to change. It was subtle at first, Just a slight shift in the expression on its face, a small twist of its lips. But soon, the face twisted more violently, like a mask that had been stretched too far. The skin began to darken, the features distorting into something grotesque. Its eyes, once empty, began to fill with something darker. And then it smiled. It wasn't my smile. It was an expression of something far more sinister, something I couldn't comprehend. And as the train began to move again, picking up speed with a force that rattled my bones, I knew. I wasn't getting off this train. And whatever this thing beside me was, it wasn't going to let me leave. The train sped up, faster and faster, until I could no longer tell if we were going forward or backward. Time itself felt warped, like we were riding through some nightmare, a place where the tracks led to nowhere and the ride would never end. The only thing I knew for sure was this. The endless ride had just begun. I couldn't escape it. No matter how hard I tried to look away, no matter how many times I blinked to clear the image from my mind, the figure beside me remained. It wasn't just an eerie reflection anymore. It was more than that. It was a presence, something I couldn't ignore, something that seemed to grow stronger the longer I sat in silence. Its eyes, the ones that were once my own, followed my every movement. Its smile, wide and twisted, never faltered. The train sped up even more. The wheels groaned beneath us, the sound of the tracks merging into a continuous, unbroken roar. The air in the car was thick, heavy with the cold, and I could feel my breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. I wasn't sure if I was panicking or if the very atmosphere of the train was suffocating me. "Why won't you talk to me?" The voice was soft, but it cut through the roar of the train. It wasn't mine. It wasn't the same voice I had heard earlier. It was deeper, quieter, almost like a whisper in my mind, but the words were clear. "You've been avoiding me. Running from me." I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to acknowledge it. But there was no escaping the truth. I looked at the figure beside me again, and I felt the cold sweat rising along my spine. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my throat dry, my body trembling from the sheer weight of what was happening. The question had been burning in me, bubbling up with each passing moment. I needed to know, needed to understand what had been happening to me on this train. Why everything felt wrong. Why this thing was sitting next to me. It smiled wider, the expression somehow both familiar and terrifying. "I've been with you longer than you realize. You know me." I recoiled, my head spinning. No, this couldn't be real. It couldn't be possible. How could I know this thing? "I've always been a part of you," it continued, its voice carrying a strange, knowing edge. "But now it's time for us to be together, truly together." I felt my pulse quicken, my thoughts racing. This wasn't a mere hallucination or some trick of the mind. This thing, this passenger, was something I had been running from. Something I had always known, but couldn't remember. But then, in a flash, it hit me. I had seen it before. Not just seen it, but felt it. It was in the reflection I'd glimpsed in the window earlier. It was in the pit of my stomach whenever I tried to leave, whenever I tried to find a way out of this nightmare. It was the dark part of myself, the shadow I had buried deep inside, the part of me that had never truly let go. "You," I whispered, horrified. "You're me?" The thing beside me nodded, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "Not exactly, but I am what you've ignored. I am what you've left behind, the side of you that you couldn't accept, couldn't understand." It paused, a cruel glimmer dancing in its eyes. "I'm the one you've been running from your entire life." My hands were shaking now, my thoughts a jumbled mess. The train hurtled forward, the speed becoming almost unbearable, but I could barely feel it anymore. The pressure in the air, the sensation of being trapped, all of it faded in comparison to the revelation that had just crashed into me. "I don't want to be you," I whispered through clenched teeth, though deep down I knew that wasn't entirely true. The more I heard it speak, the more I began to understand. It wasn't just some external force. It was an extension of myself, a part of me that I had never allowed to surface, a part of me that I had fought so hard to keep buried. "It's too late for that," it said with an almost pitying smile. "You can't run from me anymore. You never really could." I closed my eyes, but the image of its face didn't go away. It burned itself into the back of my eyelids, its voice echoing in the empty spaces of my mind. "Why are you doing this?" I choked out. "What do you want from me?" The figure beside me tilted its head, considering the question. I'm not doing anything. I'm simply allowing you to see the truth. You can't escape who you are, no matter how hard you try. We are the same. It paused, its smile widening. And now, you'll never be alone again. The lights flickered above us, casting long, distorted shadows across the train. The car seemed to stretch and warp, the edges blurring into darkness. I could feel the weight of its words, its presence, pressing against me, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but the more I struggled, the more I realized that it wasn't the train that was keeping me here. It was me. You're not getting away. The figure's voice was soft, almost a caress now. This is where you belong. We'll ride together, forever. The train screeched again, but this time the sound felt different. It wasn't just the train moving along the tracks anymore. It felt like the tracks themselves were closing in, wrapping around me, pulling me deeper into whatever nightmare this was. I looked around at the other passengers, hoping for a sign that someone else could see the truth, that I wasn't losing my mind. But their eyes were still empty. Their faces were still hollow, their bodies still frozen in place. I was completely alone, except for the passenger beside me, the one who was me, the one who had always been me. We'll get there soon, it whispered in my ear, its breath cold against my skin. And then you'll understand. We'll both understand. The journey never ends, we're bound together. And as the train sped toward the unknown, I realized with chilling certainty that there was no escape. The passenger had been revealed, and now we were one. It started without warning. I had been waiting on the platform for what felt like an eternity, the cold air biting at my skin, the dull hum of the city faint in the distance. The train was late, too late, and I had begun to wonder if it was even coming at all. It wasn't the first time I'd waited for a train that never arrived, but this time felt different. There was a certain unease in the air, something heavy that pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The station was nearly empty, save for a few scattered commuters, their faces hidden behind newspapers or the glow of their phones. I checked my watch again. The time read 11:47 p.m. According to the schedule, the train should have been here by 11:30. I felt my impatience begin to grow. I had a meeting in the morning, important, urgent, and I needed to get home. But as I stood there, watching the shadows stretch across the platform, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then I heard it. A distant sound, almost like the soft rumble of thunder rolling in from the darkness beyond the platform. It was too steady, too deliberate to be the wind or any kind of passing storm. I turned toward the source of the sound, squinting into the night. The platform was bathed in the harsh glow of the overhead lights. But beyond the safety of the station's glow, the tracks disappeared into a sea of darkness. No headlights, no sign of an approaching train, just blackness. But then, as if materializing from the very shadows, the train appeared. It wasn't the usual sleek, modern train I had come to expect. No, this one was different. The carriages were old-fashioned, the kind you might see in a historical museum, with brass handles and faded, peeling paint. The headlights cut through the night with an eerie intensity, but the train itself was too quiet, moving too smoothly along the tracks. It was almost as if it didn't belong in this time at all. My first instinct was to step back. The air had changed, become thicker, colder. The train seemed to materialize out of nowhere, and yet there it was, sitting on the tracks as though it had always been there. I hadn't heard the telltale screech of its approach, hadn't felt the usual vibrations in the air. It just appeared. I stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. The train doors slid open with a hiss, the dark interior of the carriages beckoning like the maw of some ancient creature. It was too late to turn back now. The few other passengers on the platform didn't seem to share my hesitation. One by one, they stepped forward, heading towards the open doors with a single-minded purpose, as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. I saw their faces, blank, unseeing, like ghosts walking among the living. They didn't speak, didn't look at one another. They simply boarded the train as though it were their natural destination. I wanted to leave, to turn around and walk away, but something held me in place. The train's presence was overwhelming, like a dark magnetic force pulling me toward it. Without even realizing it, I found myself moving toward the train, my feet carrying me forward as though someone else had taken control of my body. Before I knew it, I was standing at the door. The interior was dimly lit, the atmosphere thick with an unnerving stillness. The seats inside were plush but worn, the upholstery faded and torn in places. It felt abandoned, forgotten, and yet there was something about it that felt undeniably familiar, like it had been waiting for me. I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder at the now empty platform. The few people who had been waiting were already on board, their faces lost in the gloom of the train's interior. I couldn't see them clearly anymore, only their silhouettes shrouded in darkness. I stepped inside. The door slid shut behind me with an unsettling finality, the hiss of the closing doors sending a chill down my spine. The train jerked forward with an unexpected force, and we began to move, leaving the station behind. I sank into one of the plush seats near the window, still disoriented, still unsure of what had just happened. The train seemed to glide over the tracks with unnatural smoothness, the scenery outside blurring into indistinct shapes as the night swallowed everything in its path. I glanced around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The other passengers sat silently, their eyes fixed on the floor or staring vacantly ahead. Not a single word was exchanged. The air inside the train felt thick, almost oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. And then, just as I began to question whether I had made a mistake boarding, the train slowed. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows along the walls. The hum of the train grew louder, and I could hear the faint sound of something, whispers, drifting through the air. But the sound wasn't coming from the passengers. No, it was something else, something deeper, something older. I looked out the window again, but now the scenery had completely changed. Instead of the familiar stretch of city and countryside, I saw nothing but dark, endless fields. No lights, no landmarks, no signs of civilization. Just emptiness, stretching on for miles. The train had left the station. But where was it going? I couldn't answer that, and I had a sinking feeling that the answer might be something I wasn't meant to know. The train didn't feel like it was taking me somewhere. It felt like it was taking me away from everything I knew, away from the life I had been living. And I couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter how hard I tried, I would never be able to return. The train had left the station, and there was no turning back now. The train kept moving, its rhythmic hum and steady motion lulling me into a false sense of normalcy, even as the dark outside pressed in like a living thing. The windows were tinted, obscuring any hope of seeing anything beyond the deep, unnatural blackness that surrounded us. There were no stars, no moon. The sky was as thick as ink, and the land we traveled through seemed to have been swallowed whole by it. I glanced around the carriage. The other passengers were still silent, all of them sitting stiffly in their seats, as if frozen in time. Their faces were pale, devoid of expression, their eyes hollow and distant. There was no conversation, no movement beyond the occasional shallow breath. The air was thick and oppressive, filled with a heaviness that made it hard to think clearly. I tried to shake off the growing unease, but it was useless. The more I looked, the more the silence felt suffocating. It wasn't just the passengers, it was the train itself. Everything felt wrong, as if this journey wasn't just through space, but through something deeper, more elusive. The lights flickered once, briefly casting the carriage into darkness. When they came back on, I found myself holding my breath, my gaze drawn toward a figure that hadn't been there before. A man. He stood at the far end of the car, in the aisle, staring straight at me. His features were indistinct, his face blurred, as though I couldn't quite focus on him. He was tall, wearing a long coat that looked outdated, but what struck me the most was the way he stood completely still. His eyes locked onto mine with a gaze that made my skin crawl. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. It was as though my eyes had been anchored to his, drawn to him by some unseen force. His lips moved, though no sound came from them. I could see the shape of the words, slow, deliberate, as though he was speaking a language I almost understood. It felt like a warning, like a message too important to ignore. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and when they returned, the man was gone. I blinked, the confusion setting in as I scanned the car. No sign of him. It was as if he had never been there at all. The other passengers hadn't noticed anything. They hadn't even moved. The same vacant expression stared ahead, unblinking, untouched by whatever had just happened. I looked down at my hands, feeling a strange sense of detachment, as though I were no longer sure of my own reality. Had I imagined it? Had it all been some trick of the mind brought on by the unnerving atmosphere of the train? Or was there something more going on here? Something that I wasn't prepared to understand? I couldn't be sure, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The train continued its relentless journey, speeding faster now, the tracks beneath us vibrating with an increasing intensity. Time felt like it was warping. It was as if the hours were slipping away into a timeless void. I couldn't tell how long I had been aboard this train, or if it was even possible to measure time here. Every glance at my watch only deepened the confusion. The hands had stopped moving, frozen at 12 a.m. And then, just as I was beginning to wonder if I had lost my mind entirely, the loudspeaker crackled to life, breaking the silence that had settled over the car. "Next station, the end of the line," a voice announced, its tone flat, devoid of emotion. The words were simple, but they sent a cold chill running down my spine. The end of the line. What did that mean? Where was this train headed? I could feel my heart pounding in my chest now, a frantic beat that mirrored the rising dread in my gut. This wasn't a normal journey. It wasn't just a train ride. It was something else entirely, something that had no beginning and no end. I looked around at the other passengers again, trying to find some sign that I wasn't alone in feeling the weight of this nightmare. But no one moved. No one reacted. It was as though they were all sleepwalking through the same horror, locked in their own personal worlds, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the truth of our situation. The train slowed slightly as if preparing to stop. I pressed my face to the window, straining to see something, anything that would explain where we were. But the blackness outside had only deepened. There was nothing but the void. "End of the line," the voice repeated, this time with a subtle, unsettling shift, as if it was aware of my rising panic. The train came to a complete stop. The sudden silence that followed was deafening, even more oppressive than the noise had been. I felt as though the air itself had thickened, becoming heavier, pushing against my chest, suffocating me. The doors to the train car slid open with a hiss, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I had no idea what I expected to see outside, but when I looked, the emptiness was worse than anything I could have imagined. The station was gone. The platform was gone. There was no city, no lights, no signs of life. Just a vast, endless expanse of black, an endless night that stretched on without end. The train doors remained open and a cold wind blew in, carrying with it the smell of something old, decaying, forgotten. It was then that I understood. There was no destination. This was the end of the line, not in a literal sense, but in the sense that there was nowhere to go from here. The train had stopped because it could not go any further. We were trapped. The doors remained open. And as I stood there, staring into the abyss, I knew that we weren't meant to leave. This wasn't a place where people came and went. This was a place where time stopped, where the train kept going and we kept riding, even if we couldn't remember where we'd been. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, staring into the dark, but one thing was certain now: we would never leave. The night had no end, and neither did the train. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring into the abyss, but eventually the doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and the train began to move again. The unsettling screech of the wheels on the tracks echoed through the car, but it was muffled, distant, like we weren't even on the same plane of existence anymore. The lights inside flickered erratically, casting strange angular shadows across the empty car. I sank back into my seat, trying to make sense of everything, but nothing seemed real. The station, the one I'd seen moments before the train left, was a distant memory now. I couldn't be sure it had ever existed. I glanced down at my watch again, but the hands remained frozen at 12 a.m. The train was stuck in time, and it felt like I was stuck with it. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the dizziness that had settled in my head, but when I opened them, I saw something new. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a chill that cut through the car, but then I noticed it clearly. There were figures moving in the shadows just beyond the reach of the flickering lights. They weren't visible in any concrete way, but they were there. I could feel them. They were moving through the car, but I couldn't make out their faces, couldn't discern their forms. It was like watching silhouettes through frosted glass, indistinct yet undeniably present. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wasn't alone. The other passengers sat motionless, their vacant expressions unchanged, their bodies stiff. It was as though they were unaware of the presence that had filled the car. I looked around, trying to find someone else who might be reacting, but everyone else seemed to be trapped in their own private worlds. Even the person sitting directly across from me hadn't moved. The stillness was suffocating. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking beneath me. The figures were closer now, moving with an unnatural fluidity, as if they were drifting rather than walking. They didn't seem to be made of solid matter. They were more like shadows, more like impressions in the air, barely visible but impossible to ignore. I took a step toward the aisle, my heartbeat quickening, and then, just as I was about to move closer, I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't the soft murmur of the other passengers, it was something else. A voice, distant and muffled like a whisper from the other side of a wall. It came from the shadows, from the space between the rows of seats. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear, urgent, desperate, pleading. I strained to hear, but the whisper faded as quickly as it had come. And as it faded, the figures around me grew stronger, more defined, though still veiled in shadows. I couldn't see their faces, but I felt their presence, pressing against me, pushing me into the aisle. I turned to the nearest passenger, a woman who had been sitting quietly beside me when I boarded. Her eyes were wide open, but her gaze was blank, staring into nothingness. I shook her arm, trying to get her attention. "Do you see them?" I whispered urgently, my voice shaking. "Do you hear them?" But the woman didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Her expression was frozen, as if she were lost in some trance, her body a lifeless shell. I could feel the figures moving closer now, circling the car, but I couldn't turn away. I felt trapped, as though every part of me was anchored to this moment, unable to break free. The whispers came again, closer now, louder, though I still couldn't understand them. The shadowy figures were all around me now, their presence suffocating, pressing in from all sides. I could see the shapes of their bodies, humanoid but wrong, distorted. There were no clear features, just impressions of figures whose outlines shifted and wavered like smoke. And their eyes, if you could call them eyes, were dark, hollow spaces, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The whispers grew louder still until they became a chorus, rising in a cacophony of unintelligible words. It was like being caught in a storm of voices, none of them clear, but all of them speaking at once, overlapping and tangled. Some of the voices were faint, like memories from long ago, while others were urgent, almost frantic. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound, but the voices filled my mind, pushing against my thoughts. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. I opened my eyes again, and the figures were gone. The car was empty, except for the silent passengers who still sat, frozen in their seats, staring ahead. The shadows had receded, leaving no trace. The oppressive air had lightened, the space now eerily still. I couldn't understand what had just happened. It was like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, and yet it was real. The figures, the whispers, they had been there. But where had they gone? I turned toward the nearest passenger, a man whose face was blank and unfeeling, and I touched his shoulder gently. "Did you hear them?" I asked quietly, my voice trembling. "Did you see them?" The man didn't respond. His eyes were vacant, as if he were no longer truly there. It was the same with every passenger on the train. They were there, but they weren't. The train continued on its path. The sound of the wheels on the tracks the only noise breaking the silence. The windows were still dark and the lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the car. I could feel the presence of the unseen passengers lingering, as if they were watching me, waiting for something. I was alone again, alone with the train, alone with the shadows, alone with the unsettling certainty that whatever had passed through the car wasn't gone. It was still there, waiting, watching, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to know what it wanted. The train had been moving for what felt like days, or was it hours? Time had become a distant concept here, slipping through my fingers like sand. The more I tried to hold on to it, the faster it evaporated. The hands of my watch still hovered at 12 a.m., frozen in place, mocking my attempts to make sense of the journey. The other passengers remained motionless, their expressions locked in eerie stillness. Their eyes were vacant, their bodies unnaturally rigid, as though they were stuck in time, just like the rest of us. And the whispers, those faint, haunting murmurs, had not returned. The only sound that filled the car was the steady rhythm of the train as it glided smoothly along the tracks, like it had always done, carrying us deeper into an uncharted abyss. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were getting closer to something inevitable. The train had been slowing down over the past few minutes, the screech of the wheels on the tracks growing louder, more pronounced. I glanced out the window, but all I could see was that same infinite blackness, the same void that had greeted us when the train had first started. There were no stations, no lights, no signs of life, just endless darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the train came to a halt. The sound of the wheels grinding to a stop echoed through the car, filling the silence with a deafening finality. For a moment, everything was still. Not a sound, not a movement. I felt my breath catch in my chest. We had stopped, but this place, this moment, felt different from any other stop I had encountered. It wasn't the usual pause at some nameless station. This felt like the end, the final stop. I looked around, my pulse quickening. The lights flickered again, casting strange shadows on the walls of the car. But this time, they didn't return to normal. The flickering persisted, as if the lights were struggling to stay on, like the train itself was fighting against whatever force held it here. A voice crackled through the loudspeaker, its tone flat, devoid of emotion, but it carried an undeniable weight. "Welcome to the final station." I froze. The words felt like a death sentence, their meaning hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The final station. My mind raced to process it, but I couldn't. What did it mean? Where were we? Had we reached the end of the line? Was this where the train would stop, for good? The doors to the car slid open slowly, their movement accompanied by an eerie groan. The cold air from outside flooded in, a sharp contrast to the stale, oppressive atmosphere inside. My breath came out in a visible puff, my heart hammering in my chest. I stared at the door, unable to move, unsure of whether I should step out or stay in this suffocating, unsettling space. The passengers were still frozen in their seats, their eyes vacant, unblinking. No one moved. No one even seemed to acknowledge that the train had stopped. I glanced at them, hoping for some sign, some indication that this wasn't real, that I wasn't the only one who was truly aware of what was happening. But there was nothing. Just silence. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me, and took a hesitant step toward the door. The moment my foot touched the ground, I felt a strange pull, an invisible force tugging at my chest, urging me forward. It was as though the train itself was calling me to step out, to face whatever lay beyond the door. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that I had no choice. I had to go. I stepped out into the unknown. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world outside the train seemed to collapse in on itself. The ground beneath my feet was not solid. It was like walking on fog, an endless expanse of shifting shadows that gave way with each step I took. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay, and the silence was suffocating, broken only by the faintest hum of the train's engines behind me. I turned back to look at the train, but it was no longer there. The carriages had disappeared, as though they had never existed. All that remained was the black void, stretching endlessly in all directions. The platform was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of darkness, as if the world had been wiped clean of everything that had ever been. I turned around, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and saw something in the distance. A figure. It was standing far off in the blackness, a silhouette against the void. It was humanoid but twisted, its shape flickering like a broken reflection in a cracked mirror. The figure was motionless, staring at me with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness, through the very fabric of reality itself. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The figure was pulling me toward it, like a magnet drawing me into its orbit. My body seemed to betray me, taking steps toward it without my command. I was moving, but I wasn't in control. And then, just as I was about to reach it, the figure spoke. "Welcome to the end." Its voice was low, distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far away. I stopped in my tracks, my mind reeling with 1,000 questions. What did it mean? What was this place? And why did it feel like I had been expected here? The figure took a step forward, its movement unnatural, like it was both there and not there at the same time. My heart raced, my legs shaking beneath me as I tried to stay rooted to the spot. "You've reached the final station," it said, its voice growing more distorted with each word. "And now, you are one of us." The words echoed in my mind, and in that moment I realized what it meant. I was not meant to leave. No one ever left the train. No one ever left the final station. We were all passengers here, forever trapped in this endless loop, bound to the tracks of eternity. The figure took another step toward me, its face now fully visible, but I couldn't make it out. It was a blur, a shifting mess of features that seemed to change with each blink. But it didn't matter. I already knew. There was no escape. The train had come to its final stop, and I, like the others, was now a part of it. Part of the station, part of the darkness, part of the endless, unbroken ride. The figure stepped forward one last time, and everything went black. The train had stopped, but the journey had only just begun. I had always been told not to take that tunnel. The warnings came from every direction. Local legends, the train conductor, even the weathered old man who lived on the edge of the platform. They all had the same message: never enter the tunnel that runs beneath the tracks. But when the train broke down and the usual routes were blocked by some inexplicable mechanical failure, there was nothing left to do but walk. The next station was miles away, and the idea of waiting for help in the eerie silence of the stalled train made me shudder. So, against every instinct that screamed for me to stay inside, I made the decision. I would walk through the tunnel. It seemed like a reasonable choice, at least at the time. The train had come to a stop in the middle of nowhere. The platform had been deserted. No one had been around to tell me how long we'd been there, whether minutes or hours. The lights flickered above me as I gathered my things. The outside world was dark and unnervingly quiet, as though the air itself was holding its breath. The station lay behind me, a distant speck in the dark. I looked down at the tunnel entrance. It was a yawning black void, the edges jagged, as though the earth had opened up its mouth to swallow anything that dared to enter. The air around it was colder than the night, thick with an unnatural chill that clung to my skin. I hesitated for only a moment. Then, with a deep breath, I stepped forward. The tunnel was as I had expected. Dark, cramped, and suffocating. The walls were damp, water dripping somewhere far ahead, the only sound in the vast emptiness. The dim light from the broken train flickered far behind me as I entered deeper into the darkness, the cool air brushing against my face. It felt as though the tunnel stretched for miles, its curves and twists leading into the unknown. I had only gone a few hundred feet when I heard it. A whisper, soft at first, barely audible over the echo of my footsteps. It was like someone calling my name from far, far away. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped and turned, but there was no one there, only the oppressive darkness that surrounded me. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, some trick of the mind, but as I continued walking, the whispers became clearer. Not one voice, several. A chorus of murmurs that seemed to float just beyond my hearing, so close yet out of reach. I strained my ears, listening. The voices weren't just whispering. They were speaking, but the words were muffled, as though they were buried under layers of stone. My pace quickened, my breathing shallow. I tried to block out the voices, but they followed me, echoing off the walls, surrounding me in the gloom. "Turn back. Don't go any further. You shouldn't be here." The words were urgent, fearful. The voices overlapped, layered on top of each other, begging me to leave. But something inside me, something deep in the pit of my stomach, told me I had to keep going. The tunnel had become alive with sound, and I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the voices. The air felt different. It felt like there was something with me, something that watched from the darkness just out of sight. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to ignore the unease creeping through my body. I had to reach the other side. I had to. The whispers grew louder, and then a new sound, a sharp and unnatural, coming from somewhere ahead. It was the sound of metal dragging against stone, slow, deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I wasn't alone. Whatever it was that had been whispering to me, whatever had been watching from the shadows, was moving closer. I could feel its presence in the air, heavy, pressing against my chest, as though it was right behind me, inching closer with every passing second. My heart thudded in my ears as I hurried down the tunnel, my footsteps quickening to a panicked rhythm. But no matter how fast I moved, the scraping sound grew louder, closer. It was no longer just the noise of metal. It was something more. Something that dragged, scraped, and scratched against the stone walls. A shiver ran down my spine, and I dared not turn around. I couldn't. I had to reach the other end. I stumbled, my breath ragged as the darkness pressed in closer. The tunnel seemed to stretch before me endlessly, mocking my attempt to escape. The whispers now mixed with the scraping sound, as though the voices themselves were being torn apart, pulled from the very walls of the tunnel. The scraping stopped. I froze, my heart racing, every muscle tense, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any noise I had heard before. It felt suffocating. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I stood motionless, eyes darting across the darkened walls. And then, from the shadows ahead, I saw it. A figure. It was standing at the far end of the tunnel, just barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew it was watching me. I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking. The air around it seemed to ripple, as though the very darkness itself was bending to its presence. The whispers began again, louder this time, frantic. Leave. Leave now. It's too late. But I couldn't turn back. I had come this far, and I had to know what waited ahead. I took a step forward, and the figure stepped with me, its movement smooth, almost predatory. I couldn't make myself look away. My legs moved of their own accord, carrying me toward it, toward whatever it was. I should have turned back. I should have listened to the voices. But now it was too late. The figure moved closer, and with it came the whispers, the scraping sound, the cold. I was no longer walking. I was running. I ran faster than I ever thought I could, my feet slapping against the uneven ground as I sprinted through the tunnel. The darkness around me seemed to close in, the walls narrowing as if they were trying to trap me. Every corner I passed seemed to stretch, and every time I looked back, the figure was closer, though it never moved. It wasn't just its presence that haunted me. It was the air itself, thick with tension, as if the very atmosphere was alive and reaching for me. The scraping sound was gone, replaced by a low hum that vibrated in the air, the kind you feel deep in your chest. I could almost hear it in my bones, and it felt like it was coming from below, as if the tunnel itself was alive, breathing beneath me. The whispers had also intensified, no longer soft and distant but jagged, like 100 voices shouting at once from the very depths of the earth. I paused, my chest heaving as I pressed my back against the cold, damp wall of the tunnel. I couldn't hear anything except the pounding of my heart and the low hum beneath my feet. The walls around me seemed to pulse with an energy that made me want to scream. I felt the pressure building in my head, as though something was pushing against me from the inside. I needed to keep moving, but every part of me screamed to stop, to listen, to understand. Then, just as I thought I might collapse from exhaustion, I heard it. A voice. Not a whisper, but a voice, clear and guttural, coming from below. "Help me." The voice wasn't human. It was distorted, like it had been filtered through some otherworldly static, as if it was coming from the very ground beneath me. The words were slow, drawn out, and they carried a sense of urgency that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Help me. Please." I couldn't tell whether it was one voice or many, but the desperation was clear. The voice, or voices, seemed to be calling from the tunnel's floor, from the depths below the tracks, where the darkness was so complete that not even the faintest glow of light could reach it. I had no idea what was down there, but whatever it was, it wanted something. I stepped away from the wall, inching toward the sound, but as soon as I did, the voice fell silent. A chill spread across my body, and I looked down at the ground, the walls of the tunnel seeming to close in on me. I was afraid to move, afraid to stay still. The tunnel felt too tight, too suffocating, and whatever lay beneath the floor, whatever had spoken to me, had to be worse than the thing I had already encountered. And then, just as I was about to turn around and continue running, I heard the voice again, this time from further down the tunnel. Don't listen to them. The warning was sharp, but the voice that spoke was colder than the last. It came from the darkness ahead, deeper into the tunnel, and its tone was filled with malice. The sound of it made my stomach twist, and for a moment I froze, my mind spinning. What was going on here? Who was speaking? And who had warned me to turn back? The whispers began again, louder now, each voice merging into one until the sound became a relentless tide of words crashing over me. Some were angry, some were pleading, but all of them were urgent. You shouldn't have come down here. It's not what you think. The thing in the shadows will take you next. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the voices, but they only seemed to grow louder, more chaotic. They weren't just speaking to me. They were speaking to each other, overlapping, entwining into a maddening chorus. And then, from the deepest part of the tunnel, I heard it. A low, growling rumble that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath my feet. The hum beneath me intensified, louder now, as if something was stirring far below. My stomach churned. It wasn't just a voice, it was a warning. The ground beneath me felt like it was moving, shifting, groaning under some invisible weight. The last voice I heard wasn't a whisper, it was a roar. Run! I didn't think, I just reacted. My legs carried me forward without hesitation, the words still echoing in my mind. I ran like I had never run before, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted deeper into the tunnel, the chaos of voices and the rumble of something huge behind me. The air was thick, pushing against me with an almost physical force. I couldn't see what was chasing me, but I knew, I could feel it. Something was coming for me. Something from below, something that had been waiting in the dark for far too long. I looked over my shoulder once, but I couldn't see anything in the thick blackness that stretched behind me. It didn't matter. The fear was there, all-encompassing, suffocating. My legs burned with each step, but I couldn't stop. I had to get out. I had to escape. And then I saw it. The faintest glimmer of light ahead. I didn't question it. I didn't stop to wonder if it was real. I ran toward it with everything I had, feeling the air around me grow colder and colder with each step. But the deeper I ran, the more it seemed like the light was moving farther away, like it was retreating from me. The tunnel stretched, the shadows lengthened, and the whispers grew louder still, mixing with the terrible growl from below. But then, just as I thought I would lose the light entirely, the ground beneath me began to tremble. The rumbling deepened, vibrating through the walls, and the entire tunnel seemed to shift as if something enormous was breaking through the earth itself. The light flickered, then vanished. And the voices, the growls, the hum, they stopped. Silence. I stood frozen in place, my chest heaving, unable to breathe as the world around me went still. But I knew that the silence was only temporary. The thing from below had not stopped. It was still there, just waiting for me to make my next move. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for whatever came next. I don't remember how long I stood there, breathless and trembling, staring into the dark expanse ahead. The silence that followed the rumbling, the growling, the relentless voices felt heavier than any sound. It wrapped around me like a cold fog, smothering everything. I was suffocating in it. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt the pull of something I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the fear that held me there. It was as if the tunnel itself was calling to me, urging me to continue, to push forward into the unknown. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to retrace my steps and somehow find the courage to escape the nightmare that was unfolding beneath the earth. But my legs, numb with fear, didn't move. They couldn't move. Then something changed. A faint breeze. So soft I almost missed it. A whisper of air, like a forgotten memory brushing against my skin. My heart thudded in my chest as I turned slowly, feeling as though the tunnel had shifted around me. The air was no longer suffocating. It was cool, almost welcoming. The oppressive weight of the darkness seemed to loosen just a little, as if some unseen force had opened a door I hadn't noticed before. I stepped forward cautiously, my feet dragging through the dust and gravel that littered the tunnel floor. The whispers were gone now, replaced by an eerie stillness. A perfect silence that seemed unnatural. It was as if the entire tunnel was holding its breath, waiting. And then I saw it. At first, it was barely noticeable. A faint outline in the wall ahead, something different from the jagged, uneven stone that made up the rest of the tunnel. But as I drew closer, I saw that it was an archway, hidden behind the thick layers of darkness. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a single person to pass through, but the shape of it was unmistakable. The edges were smooth, worn down by time, as though it had been forgotten long ago. It didn't belong here. I stepped closer, my fingers brushing against the cold stone of the arch. The air around it felt different, cooler, older, like a memory that had been sealed away for centuries. There was something unsettlingly familiar about it, though I couldn't place why. My fingers trembled as I traced the edges of the arch, my heart racing. This wasn't part of the tunnel I had entered through. It didn't belong here at all. I swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave the arch alone, but curiosity gnawed at me. The passage, hidden for so long, seemed to whisper its own invitation. I could feel it pulling at me, urging me forward into whatever lay beyond. With a deep breath, I stepped through. The passage was tight, too tight. The air felt thicker, heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The passage stretched forward in a narrow, winding path, curving out of sight ahead. The walls were made of stone, much older and smoother than the jagged, rough-hewn tunnel I had just been in. There was a strange, faint scent in the air, a mix of earth, damp stone, and something older. As I moved forward, the silence was absolute. No echoes of my footsteps, no whispers, no growls. It was as though the world outside this passage had ceased to exist. There was only the darkness, the cold, and the oppressive sense that something ancient was watching me, waiting for me to uncover the secrets hidden in the depths of this forgotten place. The deeper I walked, the more the feeling of wrongness grew. I should have turned back. I knew that now. I knew I should never have entered this passage, but my feet kept moving, almost as if they had a mind of their own. It was like the tunnel was guiding me, pulling me deeper and deeper into its depths. The air was growing colder with each step, and the stone beneath my feet felt slick with moisture, as though the very walls were sweating, trying to expel whatever evil had taken root here. Then, a noise. Not a whisper, not a voice. It was a sound of something, dragging, scraping across the stone floor just ahead of me. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. For a moment, the world went still. No, I thought, I'm not ready for this. But my feet didn't stop. They couldn't stop. There was something ahead, something that I needed to see, something that was pulling me forward. The scraping sound continued, closer now, and then I saw it. A figure, lurking in the shadows. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its form hunched and twisted, like something that was never meant to stand upright. It was moving slowly, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, dragging across the floor. A low groan came from it, as though the very sound was being torn from its chest. I could barely make out its features, but I didn't need to see them. The feeling it gave off was enough. It was wrong, so wrong. Every instinct in my body told me to run, but I couldn't. My feet were glued to the floor, my body paralyzed with fear. And then it spoke. Not with a voice, but with a presence. I felt it deep in my bones, in my soul. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered. Not to me, but to itself, as if the very walls of the passage were echoing the words. It was like the tunnel was alive, breathing with the figure, living with it. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. My throat felt tight, my breath shallow. The figure's head turned slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of its eyes. If they could be called eyes. They were hollow, deep black pits that seemed to absorb the light around them. I could feel them inside me, searching, probing, until I thought I might lose my mind. The passage ahead seemed to stretch forever now. The walls were closing in around me, and the light, the faint flickering light that had guided me here, was fading. The scraping sound started again, this time closer, much closer. I didn't know how much time had passed since I'd entered the forgotten passage. It could have been hours, it could have been days. But I knew this much, I wasn't alone anymore. Whatever lay ahead was waiting for me, and there was no way back. I had to keep going. But deep down, I knew that in doing so, I was walking straight into something far worse than the thing that had been chasing me through the tunnel. And it was getting closer. The passage was suffocating, the walls tightening with every step I took. My body felt heavy, as though the air itself had become thick, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat a desperate reminder that I was still alive, still clinging to some fragment of reality in the face of all the darkness that surrounded me. But the thing that watched, that thing was real, and it was not human. I could feel it, a presence just behind me, just out of reach, a terrible, oppressive weight that hung in the air, pressing down on my every movement. It wasn't just the figure I had seen earlier, the one in the shadows, scraping across the stone floor. No, this was something else, something far more primal, far more ancient. It wasn't physical, but its presence was unmistakable. It was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it in the very fabric of the tunnel itself. Every inch of stone, every grain of dirt beneath my feet seemed to hum with its energy, its intent. It was like I was walking in the belly of some ancient creature, and it was awake, aware of me, tracking my every movement. The air grew colder still. I pulled my jacket tighter around my body, trying to shake off the cold that had seeped into my bones. But it didn't help. The cold wasn't natural. It was something else, something ancient and malevolent. It clung to me, made my skin crawl. I stopped again. I had no idea how far I had gone, how deep into the earth I had descended. My feet felt numb, my legs weak from the constant tension, but still, I couldn't stop moving. I was drawn forward, pulled by some force that I didn't understand. It was like the tunnel itself was alive, like it was guiding me to something, pushing me toward whatever horror awaited. And then, I heard it again, a scraping noise. Soft, slow, deliberate. It was too quiet to be a person. This sound came from something much bigger, something that was not meant to move like this, not meant to make this noise. The sound came from behind me, from the darkness where I couldn't see. I didn't turn around. I knew if I did, I would lose whatever courage was left inside me. The presence was still there, that terrible thing that watched me. It wasn't just following me anymore. It was with me. It was inside the tunnel, inside my mind, pressing on me like a weight I couldn't shake. Every movement I made, every step I took, was met with an almost imperceptible shift in the air, as if it was adjusting to my presence, learning my rhythm. I tried to ignore it, tried to keep moving forward, but the whispers from earlier began again. Faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder with every step. Turn back. It sees you. It is always watching. The voices twisted, became more frantic, more desperate. They were not just voices now. They were a force, a part of the tunnel itself. The walls seemed to pulse with them, the air vibrating with their urgency. The whispers were warning me, but I wasn't sure who they were warning. Me? Or the thing that followed? Maybe it was both. I didn't want to know. The scraping noise stopped, and for a moment there was silence. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, the kind that makes your skin feel too tight. I stood perfectly still, holding my breath, straining to listen. And then it came. A low, guttural growl, so deep I could feel it in my chest. It was coming from the shadows ahead of me, but it was no animal. It wasn't anything I had ever heard before. This was something else, something that had been asleep for an eternity, and now it was awake. I dared a glance toward the dark stretch of tunnel ahead. And for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something. A shape, a flicker in the darkness, a pale, distorted figure that shimmered and shifted, as though it was only half there. It was too far away to see clearly, but the glimpse was enough to send a jolt of cold panic straight through me. My heart pounded in my chest. I could feel it now, in the pit of my stomach. It was no longer just a presence. It was here. It was coming for me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then from the darkness ahead, a pair of eyes glinted. The pupils were black. No, not black. Empty. Hollow pits. Voids that seemed to suck in the light around them, drawing everything into them. They were watching me. I didn't know how, but I knew those eyes could see me. I could feel them, inside me, scraping at the edges of my mind. The growl came again, louder this time. A deep, terrifying sound that echoed through the tunnel. It was too close now. The thing that watched was near, and I wasn't sure if it had always been there, lurking in the shadows, or if it had only just materialized. Either way, it was now a part of the tunnel, a part of the dark, a part of me. I took a step back, my body moving on pure instinct. But there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in, the passage narrowing with each passing moment. The eyes in the darkness glinted again, and the growl reverberated through my bones. I was trapped. I spun around, desperate to run, to escape, but the tunnel was no longer the same. The walls seemed to twist, the passage itself warping, shifting as though the earth was rearranging itself to block my path. The light from my phone flickered, casting long, trembling shadows ahead. And there, just beyond the circle of light, I saw it. The thing that watched me was moving, slithering out from the shadows. Its form was impossible, like something that was never meant to exist, yet there it was, coming for me. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. All I could do was stare at it. It had no face, no features to identify it. Just a twisted shape, a contorted mass of darkness and emptiness, with those eyes, the only part of it that was real, that was solid. And those eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, waiting. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't hide from it. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop it from seeing me. I was not alone in this tunnel, and I would never be alone again. I had reached the point of no return. There was no way back, no exit, no safe haven to escape to. The tunnel, this cursed passage, had consumed me, swallowed me whole, and I was now part of its terrible rhythm, its dark heartbeat. The creature that had been following me, the thing that watched with its hollow eyes, was no longer a distant threat. It was right behind me, right beside me, its presence like a shadow I could not escape, a weight that pressed on my every step. I had no choice but to move forward. The cold that had once nipped at my skin had now seeped into my bones, an unnatural chill that no amount of movement or adrenaline could fight off. The air felt thick, almost as if the very molecules were suffocating me, trying to slow me down, to make me weaker, easier to catch. My breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale disappearing into the thick, oppressive darkness around me. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't stand still. Not with the thing so close, not with the feeling of its unblinking gaze weighing down on me. I had to keep moving, even though every fiber of my being screamed to turn back. The passage seemed endless. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, the air growing denser, more suffocating. The walls closed in tighter, like the tunnel was shrinking around me. I could feel the floor beneath me shift, slick with dampness, uneven and treacherous. The echoes of my footsteps bounced off the walls, but they sounded wrong. Distorted, stretched, like they were being pulled into some otherworldly dimension. The darkness ahead was absolute. There was no light anymore, just the faintest glow from my phone's screen, casting a weak, trembling light that barely illuminated the path in front of me. I could see the contours of the walls, the jagged edges of stone, but beyond that, the tunnel seemed to stretch into infinity, disappearing into a black void where nothing existed. Nothing but the thing that watched. I tried not to look back. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread that clawed at the back of my mind, urging me to turn around, to run, to escape. But I knew, deep down, that there was no escape. Not now. There was no place where this thing couldn't find me. I didn't want to look, but my curiosity, the same twisted curiosity that had led me this far, drove me to glance over my shoulder. And there it was. The eyes. They glowed faintly in the dark, those black, hollow pits, still fixed on me, still unblinking. They were closer now, the creature following me at a pace that mirrored mine. I could feel it, feel its presence growing, like the darkness was slowly enveloping me, pulling me into its depths. I tried to move faster, but my legs felt like lead. The tunnel seemed to grow tighter with every step, the walls pressing in, forcing me forward. There was no stopping now. I could hear it too, the faintest scraping, like claws dragging across stone. A low, guttural sound that vibrated through the floor, through my very bones. It was moving, slithering closer, and the closer it came, the louder the sound grew. It wasn't a creature that walked. It was something else entirely. Something that didn't need legs to chase me, to trap me in its web of darkness. The whispers from before returned, louder now, more insistent. They weren't just voices anymore. They were like a chorus, rising in intensity, echoing through the stone walls. You cannot escape. It sees you. You belong here now. Each whisper was a knife in my mind, a cold stab of terror. The words twisted together, warping into a singular message. I was trapped. There was no way out. I belonged here. In this place of darkness and fear, I stumbled, nearly falling to my knees as the tunnel seemed to lurch beneath me. I gasped for breath, but it was useless. The air was thick, suffocating, and there was no escaping the sense of impending doom that pressed down on me, closing in like a vice. And then, I saw it. At the end of the tunnel, a flicker of movement. Something shifting, something moving, too fast to catch, but there, just ahead, a new shape emerging from the void. It was massive, a shadow darker than the blackest night, its edges shifting like smoke. It was not like the creature that followed me, but it was part of it, connected to it in some way, a part of whatever nightmare this place had become. I forced myself to move faster, pushing my legs to run, though every step felt like it could be my last. But the faster I ran, the more the darkness seemed to close in on me. The walls grew tighter, squeezing me like a vice. The air grew colder still, the temperature dropping to levels that felt unnatural, as if the tunnel was pulling me into some frozen abyss. I wasn't just being chased anymore. I was being pulled. I could feel it in the way the floor seemed to give way beneath me, in the way my footsteps sank into the ground as though the very earth was trying to swallow me whole. The sound of the creature's scraping was deafening now, and the whispers were louder, almost overpowering. It was like the tunnel was alive, alive with the voices of everything that had ever been trapped here, everything that had ever been lost in the depths. Then I reached it. A wall. A solid, unyielding wall that had not been there moments ago. The passage ended. There was no way forward, no way to escape. I pressed my hands against the cold stone, trying to force my way through, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature was close now, so close I could feel its presence behind me, almost on top of me. I turned around, half expecting to see it in full form, but there was nothing. Just the eyes. The empty, endless eyes. And then, for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something else, a shape emerging from the wall, a doorway, a crack in the stone barely visible but there. I didn't hesitate. I ran for it, slamming my body against the stone, praying that the wall would give way. And to my disbelief, it did. The passage opened, and I stepped into the unknown. What lay ahead, I couldn't say. The air was colder here, the darkness deeper, more oppressive than before. But I knew one thing for sure. The tunnel had no end. It was not just a place, it was a prison, an endless descent into something far worse than any nightmare I had ever known. And the thing that watched? It was still with me, still lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to take my next step. But I had no choice. I had no choice but to step deeper into the abyss.
Stories may end, but the fear remains. Subscribe to uncover more secrets hidden in the darkness. Until we meet again in the world of nightmarish shadows.